Some interesting news today as another game developer has now publicly taken a shot at the Star Wars brand. Earlier this week, we talked about how Zynga, creators of Star Wars Hunters, attributed declining fan interest in the IP for the game's failure. Now, that's an analysis I wholeheartedly disagree with. As I broke down a couple of videos ago, Star Wars Hunters was plagued by both incongruent systems and a very poor release schedule. But what about Ubisoft? And of course, their recent release, Star Wars Outlaws. Well, let's get to the quote first, then I will give my thoughts, and I've got many. So this came from the recent Ubisoft 2025 shareholder meeting. I wouldn't want to be an executive at Ubisoft, by the way, having to give this speech, but Yves Guillemot, the founder of Ubisoft, said the following. For Star Wars Outlaws, we didn't reach our sales target. The game suffered from a number of items. First, it suffered from the fact that it was released at a time when the brand that it belonged to, i.e. Star Wars, was in a bit of choppy waters, and the game had a few items that still needed to be polished, and they were polished and debugged in the early weeks, but it did affect sales volumes. Listen, I understand that as an executive, you need to, whenever possible, point to external factors outside of your control when you have a product failure, but we also need to be realistic here, and I do feel for Ubisoft. Despite what I'm about to say, I like Ubisoft as a company, or at least I like the idea of what Ubisoft could be. Assassin's Creed, Watch Dogs, Splinter Cell, they're all games or franchises that at least at some point I've really dug. I also just generally like to support Canadian game studios, and Ubisoft Montreal and Toronto do a ton of work in the country. But like I said, there needs to be some soul searching here. Ubisoft is, to put it mildly, crashing, which is why I said I would not want to be an executive having to answer to shareholders. The company has had serious financial issues for the past several years. They've had major layoffs, and if we're going to talk about the failure of Star Wars Outlaws, I think we have a pretty interesting opportunity here to see what has more failures associated with it. Star Wars as a video game brand, a modern video game brand, or Ubisoft. And I think we all know how this is going to go. So in terms of major releases preceding Star Wars Outlaws, we had X Defiance, meant to be a live service game, dead within a year, massive failure. We had the hugely maligned and mocked Skull and Bones, a game that I personally was really disappointed in because we need more pirate games, more ship games. That also sold extraordinarily poorly according to most reports. We have Prince of Persia, which admittedly I've not played but heard very good things, although commercially another disappointment. Then Avatar, which I found this on the wiki page. I played this, very good description. Kotaku called it the okayest game of 2023. The commercial disappointment of Star Wars Outlaws caused Ubisoft to push back the release date for Assassin's Creed Shadows, which, according to reports, was unlikely to break even due to relatively low sales. So we have a collection here of games which did not do well, all with the Ubisoft branding on it. Why does Outlaws in particular fail? Because of the IP it's attached to. It just doesn't make sense to me. I'm going to give my thoughts on Outlaws towards the end part of this video because I do have some relatively strong ones, at least relatively strong considering how middling the game is. But we talked about the Ubisoft side, but let's compare that to recent Star Wars game releases. And I am going to stick to major console or PC releases. The Star Wars mobile scene is different. We've got Galaxy of Heroes still like a decade later churning out billions of dollars. But I also don't want to ignore the fact that Star Wars Hunters, again, Zynga cited the brand as not helping them push sales. You can think whatever you want, or downloads rather. And of course, I've got to acknowledge here that Star Wars Battlefront 2 is currently experiencing an unexpected, to put it lightly, resurgence simply because people want something with the Star Wars brand on it to play. I think Star Wars Battlefront is also a game that has some serious issues to the core of it, but it also, at noon, has 9,000 people playing it on Steam alone, which is remarkable. But let's move backwards. So, Star Wars Outlaws, that's the big game of 2024. In 2023, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor. We know EA was apparently overjoyed by the game's commercial performance and was stated to be a success. 2022 had Lego Star Wars The Skywalker Saga that personally created my Clips channel. It was so popular and apparently sold over 5 million copies, surpassing all prior Lego console releases. 2020 was Star Wars Squadrons. Personally, probably my favorite Star Wars games of all time. The multiplayer was just spectacular. That was a budget AA release, and I know personally from interacting with the people that made the game that they were extremely happy with how well the game did, to the point where, despite the fact that it was initially meant to be launched and done, they actually added new ships and maps as part of free DLC. Squadrons are just excellent. I wish more people would have given the multiplayer a chance. But continuing back, 2019, we have Jedi Fallen Order, also a massive success, obviously kicking off the brand. Then we go back further, and I think the comparisons are less meaningful because we're moving out of kind of the current era of Star Wars, given that there was a trilogy releasing and the hype was obviously higher. It's not really fair to compare those releases to current ones given the different, fan interest in the brand. My point, however, is that big Star Wars game releases tend to do well. Star Wars Outlaws is an outlier when it comes to console releases. On the other hand, Ubisoft games have been doing poorly. Star Wars Outlaws is not an outlier. It having a massive Jedi Survivor or Jedi Fallen Order success would have been an outlier for Ubisoft, and I think that is what they were hoping for. They definitely had plans to do a lot more with Outlaws, which we just aren't going to get. I think the issues with Ubisoft are obvious. They've made the same game too many times. And I know if you are a gamer, when I say Ubisoft, you probably think of game series which at times have been great, but ultimately have been watered down by the Ubisoft formula. Clearing bases, a large but shallow open world. We've seen it in Far Cry, Assassin's Creed. I personally felt like Frontiers of Pandora was a lot of the same, and certainly to me, Star Wars Outlaws is as well. Now listen, I don't think Star Wars Outlaws is a terrible game, and I know people who really enjoyed it. To me though, it was the definition of I did one really long live stream, then I uninstalled the game and watched the cutscenes. I just could not be bothered to play through what was pretty slow and boring gameplay in order to experience the world, which I thought the world was really good. I liked the characters enough, the story didn't hit for me, but the environments and the feel of walking around in Star Wars worlds was great. It's just the gameplay was not enough to keep me coming back. If you disagree, that's fine. And I know there are Outlaws defenders, and I also know that the people who worked on the game really cared about Star Wars. I've spoken to some of them, but I think ultimately it suffered from being a Ubisoft game, which is disappointing because I would have loved to see Outlaws kick ass and kick off a new era or type of storytelling. I'd love for Outlaws to have been a massive commercial success and a better game with more sequels on the way, because that's more Star Wars content. Because ultimately, I don't accept that there's no fan interest in Star Wars games. We've gotten so few of them. Yes, some Star Wars content on Disney Plus has suffered, and we can't ignore that. Skeleton Crew is a good show, which I think suffered primarily from two things. One, people being burnt out on Star Wars and Marvel releases, and two, the failure of Disney Plus as a platform. There's not many shows releasing on Disney Plus right now which do well, and they've honestly failed to keep up with the juggernauts like Netflix, but that's something for another day. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the situation. I wholeheartedly disagree with it being a weakness in the Star Wars brand, which caused Outlaws to fail. I honestly think it's kind of similar to Hunters, where the company was relying on overwhelming fan support to save a game from the fate it otherwise deserved. And maybe that's true. Maybe Star Wars fans aren't doing that, but those are my thoughts. It's hard out there in the games industry. It really is. Let me know yours down below.